A mixin is another way to organize code that is duplicated over and over in your CSS. It is similar to add extend, but with mixins you can specify different property values by passing in arguments. It is different than extend in that the entire block of code from your mixin will be copied to the selector. This can make your code longer. Use it when the values of properties are different throughout your site. If they remain the same, use @extend instead. Let's start right away with an example. I'm in text_mixin.html, which has 3 divs in it. What I want to do with this page is style each div as a colored box. Each box will have a different size ultimately, but we'll start with having them all the same size. Each of these divs has a unique class name and some text. The file links to test.css, which does actually exist in my folder, but none of the existing CSS will style this current HTML, so we don't see any styles on the page yet. So if we look at the Sass file, it's the same file that we ended up with after the last example. I do want to set a base font on the body of the file, so all text will use the base font instead of this Times Roman. I'll use the variable $base font, which is already defined. I will watch the test Sass file. So now we can see that the font has changed. Now, instead of starting with a mixin, I'm going to review how we would do this with @extend. I want to create some boxes for each div. I will use the placeholder syntax and say $box and then give it properties. A width, height, margin, and padding. Then I'll give it a background color using the accent variable. Now I can extend the box for each one of the divs. I'm making them all unique because my assumption is that each box will have some unique properties. If they didn't, I would just assign them all the same class name. I'll save it, and then you can see the boxes take shape. Now if we look at the CSS, you can see each class in a list with all the box properties. @extend creates nice, concise code. Now let's try it with a mixin instead. So the syntax for that is @mixin, and then you give the mixin a name. So I will say @mixin box. For each box, I have to change it to say @include box. When I save it, nothing has changed as we would expect. If we look at the CSS, however, it looks different. Each class has all the properties from the box added to it. There's a lot of duplication. The reason I'm showing you this is because this is a mistake I made a lot when I first started using Sass. I learned about mixins first, and so I used them everywhere I had duplicated code. But using a mixin doesn't keep your final CSS smaller. Using @extend works better in many cases. But @mixin is very useful for those times when you want the ability to change the values of your properties. So in this example, I want a mixin that will allow for different box sizes. So I'll add parameters, or arguments as they're officially called in Sass, for the width and the height. You do that by adding parentheses after the name and putting the arguments inside. I will add width and height with a $sign before the word to indicate that these are arguments. Each argument you add is separated by a comma. Now I need to use these arguments in my mixin. So the width will be whatever is passed in from where the mixin is called. Normally I like to give a default value to my arguments. That way, if the code calling the mixin doesn't pass a value, the mixin will still work. To do that, you type a colon after the argument name, and then you give the default value. In this case, I'm going to use 100 pixels. So again, I save and look at the page, and nothing has changed since the width and height are still 100 pixels. Now this time, I'll change box 1 to have a width of 50 pixels and a height of 200. When I save it, you can see the change. Now I can change box 2 and just pass in one parameter. That will be assigned to the first argument, the width. So arguments are optional when I give defaults. We can create arguments for anything in the mixin that has a value. We could do the margin, padding, or background color. If you want to practice some more, you might want to try making some more arguments here. So you can create mixins without arguments in Sass, but if you find yourself doing this, stop and consider if add extend is what you really wanted to use. If you don't need to change the values, then try add extend instead. If you do need to change the values, then you want a mixin. Let's look at our project now and see if we can create a mixin for the rounded corners. In this site I have lots of rounded corners, but the border radius has a different value on many of them. That makes this a perfect candidate for a mixin. I should mention that when this design was created, it was more important to use all the vendor prefixes for border radius. But that's no longer the case. All the major browsers today are using border radius. The only thing you might want to worry about is early IE browsers like IE8. I'm using CSS3Py, which is this py.htc file. When I have this py file, to make border radius work in IE, I just need to add this behavior statement. So today we really only need 2 lines of code for rounded corners. But I'm going to leave this example as is for now. If I use a mixin to define my rounded corners and the code changes over time, like it has with the border radius, it's very easy to modify it in just one place. I'm going to copy these 5 lines of code and create a mixin with them. I'm going to the top where I create my placeholder for transition and variables because I like to keep them together. To create the mixin, I type @mixin and then the name, which I will call rounded. Then parentheses for the arguments. And I'll paste in the 5 lines. I'm only going to add 1 argument because I'm keeping all the radius values the same. I will default it to 7 pixels because that's the value I used in several places already. It could be anything though. Now everywhere I use that value, I have to change the 7 pixels to $radius. Everywhere I'm using border radius with only 1 value, I will include this mixin to replace the 5 lines of code. On this first one, I don't need to pass a value in because I want it to be 7 pixels, which is the default. And this next one as well. Now for this one, I do need to pass in the radius, which is 10 pixels. I can't use rounded here because this is a tab and you can't use the shorthand version of border radius. Instead, I could create a tab mixin later if I wanted to. And then I'll go through and change the rest. Now I'll save it, and I need to make sure that I'm watching the style file. And then I should scan the site and make sure that all the corners are still rounded. I think everything looks good. Let's look at the CSS generated. If I search for border radius, I won't find the mixin definition, but I will see it in all the places where I needed a rounded corner. Now here's the nice part. If I want to improve my CSS because I don't need those vendor prefixes, I can simply change the mixin. And the code will get changed everywhere the mixin is included. After I save and look at the CSS again, you can see there are only 2 lines of code being used here. And that was changed everywhere I used the mixin. It wasn't changed on the tabs because I didn't use the mixin there, but everywhere else it has changed. If you wanted to create a mixin for the tabs, you have a couple options. One thing you could do is change the rounded mixin to have 4 arguments, 1 for each of the corners, and then you could specify the radius of each corner. I don't really love this method though because then you have to specify all four corners every time you call the mixin if you're not using the default values. So I'd probably create a second mixin for the tabs. And since tabs need the first two corners to be the same and the second to be 0, I would still only need one argument. The only difference is the way I would call border radius. On this site there's only one place with tabs, so I really don't need this mixin, but if you're working on a site with different tabs, you might want to create it for yourself. One thing to keep in mind is that there are all sorts of mixins out there that others have developed. You can think of them as plugins. One great set of mixins comes with Compass, which I'm not covering in this specific course, but will probably be part of a future course. Mixins are great to use when you have a group of styles that are repeated over and over, but with slight variations between them. If you use arguments to change those values and design them with care, you can write a lot less code.